On a cold October morning in 1988, the auction yard outside Miller's Creek was already crowded before sunrise. Farmers leaned against pickup trucks, mechanics sipped coffee from dented thermoses, and local dealers wandered the rows looking for bargains. Near the back fence sat the machine nobody bothered inspecting twice. It was an aging wrecker that looked as though its best years had ended long before most of the crowd arrived. The paint had faded into patches of rust and primer. One fender was bent inward. Several lights were missing. The winch cable had been removed years earlier, and weeds grew beneath its tires as if the ground had already claimed it. People laughed whenever they passed it. One man joked that the scrap yard would charge money to take it away. Another said the only thing still working on the truck was gravity. Even the auctioneer treated it like an afterthought, mentioning it between more desirable equipment that actually drew attention from bidders. Among the crowd stood Walter Grayson, a quiet tow operator who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. He was known across the county for buying machines other people had given up on. Old tractors, broken loaders, forgotten service trucks. Most people saw junk. Walter usually saw another chance. Unlike the larger operators, he did not have deep pockets. Every purchase mattered. Every dollar had a purpose. That was why several neighbors were surprised when he stopped beside the wrecker and spent longer studying it than anyone else had. He walked around it slowly, examining the frame, the cab, and especially the boom mounted behind the cab. When the bidding finally began, interest disappeared almost immediately. The price climbed only a few dollars at a time before stalling. Laughter echoed through the crowd when Walter raised his hand again. Moments later, the hammer fell. Sold. $290. A few heads shook. Others smiled. To everyone watching, Walter had just spent good money on a machine that barely looked capable of moving under its own power. As trucks pulled onto the highway and conversations turned toward better purchases, Walter climbed into the wrecker and started the engine. The crowd drove home laughing. Walter drove home thinking about several strange welds he had noticed along the boom. They looked deliberate, almost hidden, and for reasons he could not explain, they bothered him all the way home. The wrecker had been built in 1951 by a small Midwestern manufacturer known for producing rugged recovery trucks for rural towing companies and highway contractors. Records were scarce, but Walter learned that the truck had spent most of its life working back roads, farm roads, and isolated stretches of state highway. It had pulled overturned grain trucks from muddy ditches, recovered tractors from flooded fields, and hauled stranded vehicles through snowstorms that kept newer equipment parked. Every dent carried a story, and every patch of rust seemed earned rather than neglected. By the time it reached the auction yard, decades of hard labor had taken their toll. Parts had been removed whenever owners needed quick replacements. The original winch was gone. Several gauges no longer worked. Makeshift repairs appeared everywhere. Most buyers saw an exhausted machine approaching the end of its usefulness. Walter saw something different. He believed old equipment often revealed its true value only after someone was willing to understand it. During the first few months, he worked on the wrecker whenever time allowed. He cleaned years of dirt from the frame and replaced worn hoses, cracked wiring, and missing hardware. As layers of grime disappeared, unusual details emerged. Along one section of the boom, several welds looked different from the others. Thick steel plates had been attached over older metal, creating reinforcements where no obvious stress points existed. The workmanship was surprisingly careful. Whoever had done it appeared determined to hide something or protect something. Walter asked around town. Local mechanics examined the boom and offered simple explanations. One said previous owners probably cracked the metal and patched it badly. Another guessed someone had overloaded the wrecker years earlier and added extra steel to keep it working. Most agreed there was no mystery at all. Old trucks collected strange repairs the way barns collected dust. Walter nodded and accepted the opinions because they sounded reasonable. Yet something continued bothering him. The reinforced area was too specific. The extra plates covered only one portion of the boom while the rest remained untouched. If the goal had been strength alone, why not reinforce everything? The question never fully left him. Months became years. The wrecker earned its keep, answering calls across the county and proving far more dependable than anyone expected. Yet whenever Walter performed maintenance or washed mud from the boom, his eyes drifted back to those strange welds. Seasons changed over the years in Miller's Creek, but the wrecker remained a constant sight on Walter Grayson's property. What started as an old, unwanted auction purchase slowly turned into one of the most dependable machines in his small towing operation. It was not the fastest, nor the most modern, but it always started when called and always finished the job. That alone gave it a reputation that newer trucks struggled to match. Farmers began relying on it without hesitation. When a tractor sank into soft soil after heavy rain, Walter's wrecker pulled it out. When a grain truck broke down miles from town, it was the old machine that arrived first. Local families came to trust it too, especially when newer companies charged more and arrived later. The wrecker became known not for its appearance, but for its reliability. Walter never stopped maintaining it himself. Even as newer equipment entered the market, he kept his attention on the same old boom and frame he had bought years ago. He replaced parts, carefully tightened bolts by hand, and inspected every inch after difficult recoveries. The strange welds in the boom never left his thoughts, but they remained unchanged, as if they had been designed to stay unnoticed. Meanwhile, the world around him kept moving forward. Modern tow trucks with hydraulic systems replaced older models across the county. Small repair shops closed as larger companies expanded. Machines that once seemed advanced were sold off or scrapped. Yet the old wrecker continued working through it all, surviving every shift in the industry. There were moments, especially during long winter nights, when Walter thought he heard something unusual coming from the boom. A faint hollow echo when the metal cooled, a vibration that didn't match normal wear. He would stop, place a hand on the steel, and listen closely. On a few occasions, he even climbed up to inspect the reinforced section again, shining a flashlight along the weld lines. But every time, he found nothing out of place. Still, the feeling never completely disappeared. It lingered quietly in the back of his mind. Growing stronger each year he used the machine. The boom did not behave like ordinary steel. It felt like it was hiding something rather than simply holding weight. And with every passing year, one question became harder to ignore. Could there actually be something sealed inside the structure all this time? That question stayed with him longer than any repair job, until one winter morning finally forced him to open a section of the boom that no one had touched in decades. It happened during a late winter repair that Walter Grayson would later remember more clearly than any other day in those 17 years. The wrecker had started showing signs of fatigue in its upper boom section after a difficult recovery job. A heavy farm tractor had been pulled from a deep roadside ditch, and afterward Walter noticed unusual stress marks forming along the same reinforced area he had never fully understood. At first, he tried to patch it as he always did, but the corrosion had spread deeper than expected. The metal was thinning in places that should have been solid, and for the first time, he realized simple maintenance would not be enough. The damaged section needed to be opened properly. Using cutting tools he rarely brought out, Walter began removing the outer steel plates that had puzzled him since the day of purchase. The sound of grinding metal filled the small workshop, echoing off the walls as decades-old welds were finally broken apart. Layer by layer, the reinforced section came away, revealing something he had never seen before. Inside the boom was a hollow cavity. It was not accidental. It was not the result of damage or wear. The space had been carefully shaped and enclosed as if someone had designed it with purpose. The inner walls were smooth in places where no normal repair would ever produce such precision. Even more unsettling were the welds surrounding it. They were far cleaner and more controlled than anything used on the rest of the machine, suggesting professional work done under very specific intent. Walter stepped back for a moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. For 17 years, he had assumed the reinforcement was just poor repair work. Now it was clear that assumption had been wrong. Someone had not only opened this section intentionally, but had also sealed it again with equal care. A quiet realization settled in his mind. This was not a repair. It was a concealment. His heartbeat slowed as curiosity replaced routine thought. The discovery did not feel like damage anymore. It felt like intention preserved in steel. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide something inside a working machine that had spent its life in plain sight. The longer he stared at the hollow space, the more the possibilities multiplied. Tools, documents, something valuable, or something meant never to be found. Every answer raised another question, each heavier than the last. For the first time in 17 years, the mystery was no longer distant or imagined. It was real, physical, and right in front of him, waiting to be fully uncovered. And as Walter reached for the sealed intersection, he couldn't stop himself from wondering what kind of secret was important enough to be permanently welded inside a wrecker boom in the first place. Carefully, Walter lifted the inner panel of the boom, expecting rust, debris, or maybe an old tool wedged inside during a past repair. Instead, his hand stopped as he saw a sealed metal container perfectly fitted into the hollow space. It was not loose. It was not accidental. It had been designed to sit there, protected from heat, moisture, and time itself. The container was weatherproof, its edges reinforced and sealed with industrial precision. Whoever placed it there had intended it to survive decades without being discovered. Walter hesitated for a moment before opening it, almost as if the machine itself was resisting the reveal after so many years of silence. Inside, he found carefully preserved materials wrapped in protective layers. There were documents first, old papers brown with age but still intact, ownership records, maintenance logs, and handwritten notes filled with details from another era. Alongside them were photographs, faded but still recognizable, showing the wrecker in its early working years. Maps were folded neatly, marked with routes and locations that no longer existed on modern charts. There were also letters. Some were personal, others technical, all written by the original owner or people connected to the truck's early life. The handwriting told its own story, careful, deliberate, and filled with urgency. It became clear that this was not random storage. It was a deliberate archive hidden away from the outside world. As Walter reviewed the contents, a pattern began to emerge. The documents dated back to a period of financial instability in the region, when small operators were losing businesses and equipment to debt or forced sales. The original owner had likely feared losing everything tied to the wrecker, not just the machine itself, but the history attached to it. So he had hidden it, not in a house, not in a safe, but inside the very structure of the machine he worked with every day, trusting that no one would ever think to look there. What Walter held in his hands was not just forgotten paperwork. It was a preserved record of a life, a business, and a time the town had long moved past without remembering. And as he turned another faded page, one question became impossible to ignore. Why did the original owner go to such extreme lengths to hide these records inside a working wrecker boom, knowing it might never be opened again? Outside, word of the discovery had already begun to spread quietly through the town. And as historians and longtime residents were called in to examine the contents, the true significance of what had been hidden was only just beginning to surface. News travels slowly in small towns, but once it started spreading through Miller's Creek, it moved with a kind of quiet intensity that could not be stopped. At first, it was just rumors shared at the diner, the hardware store, and the gas station. People spoke in low voices about Walter Grayson's old wrecker and something strange hidden inside its boom. Within days, the story had grown beyond simple gossip. It had become something everyone wanted to see for themselves. Some of the same people who had stood at the auction 17 years earlier returned to his yard. A few remembered laughing when Walter bought the wrecker for $290. Others had forgotten the moment entirely until they saw the machine again, standing in the same place, still marked by age but now carrying a very different weight. When historians and local experts arrived, the atmosphere shifted. The discovery was no longer just a curiosity. It became a matter of historical interest. The documents found inside the boom were carefully examined, and their contents confirmed something unexpected. They were not random papers or personal keepsakes. They represented a rare and well-preserved record of local industrial and agricultural activity from a period that had largely gone undocumented. The maps revealed old routes that had once connected farms, mills, and small businesses now long gone. The photographs showed early working conditions and equipment that had shaped the region's development. Even the letters carried significance, offering insight into the struggles of small operators during a time of economic uncertainty that had never been properly recorded in official history. As word spread, the tone around the wrecker began to change. What had once been dismissed as junk was now treated with respect. People no longer looked at it as a broken machine. They saw it as a time capsule, something that had quietly preserved history inside its frame while everyone else had overlooked it. Walter never sought attention for what he had found. He answered questions politely but never exaggerated the discovery. To him, it had always been just a machine he chose to understand when others did not. But now, without intention, he had become the caretaker of something far larger than himself. And slowly, the realization settled across the town. The machine everyone once laughed at had preserved something far more valuable than steel. It had protected a forgotten piece of their own history, hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. And that truth forced everyone to reconsider not just the wrecker, but the way they had judged it from the very beginning. 17 years later, Walter Grayson would sometimes sit beside the old wrecker in the quiet of his yard and think about how a single decision had shaped so much of his life. Back at the auction, he had not been chasing profit or recognition. He had simply seen something others ignored, and followed a feeling he could not fully explain at the time. The $290 he spent never turned into wealth in the traditional sense. It never made him a rich man, and it never changed his lifestyle overnight. But what it gave him was something far more lasting. It gave him history that might have been lost forever. It gave him purpose in caring for a machine that carried more meaning than anyone originally understood. And most importantly, it gave him a legacy tied not to money or success, but to preservation. The discovery inside the boom became a part of local memory, carefully documented and stored so future generations could understand the past that shaped their town. Over time, the wrecker itself stopped being just a working vehicle. It became a symbol. People who once dismissed it now pointed it out with respect. Visitors who heard the story came not to see rusted steel, but to see a reminder of how easily value can be overlooked when judged too quickly. The machine was eventually preserved in a secure space on his property, treated less like equipment and more like a living piece of history. Walter never claimed credit for anything beyond curiosity. When asked about it, he would simply say he bought a broken truck and took care of it like anything else he owned. But those who knew the full story understood it differently. They understood that sometimes the greatest discoveries do not come from searching for treasure, but from refusing to ignore what others have already written off. And in the end, the lesson settled quietly in the town, just like the wrecker itself had once done. The auction crowd saw rust. One man saw possibility. 17 years later, that possibility proved stronger than every laugh that followed it.